Lent, in Rudolf Steiner's spiritual scientific perspective, is not merely a historical Christian custom, nor only a moral invitation to give something up. It is a living threshold in the yearly rhythm of the earth and the human soul. It is a time in which nature itself begins to shift its gesture. The deep inwardness of winter slowly loosens, and the forces of spring begin to stir beneath the surface. Yet this stirring does not immediately appear as fullness or warmth. It appears first as tension, as a quiet struggle between what must die away and what must be born. Lent belongs to this zone of transition. It is the season where the human being can learn to read the language of metamorphosis, not as an idea, but as an experience. Steiner often speaks in a way that leads us away from abstract religiosity and toward the concrete reality of spiritual processes. In that tone, Lent becomes a schooling of the soul, a conscious participation in the movement from the old to the new, from the heavy to the light, from the merely habitual to the inwardly awakened. The human being in this period stands between two worlds. On one side, the dense accumulation of the past year, our routines, desires, reactions, judgments, and inner noise. And on the other side, a possibility of inner clearing, a preparation for the Easter experience as an event of renewal. What is essential here is that Steiner does not present the Christ event as something that happened once and remains only as belief. He speaks of it as a living cosmic and human reality that can be approached through inner work and through the rhythms of time. The yearly cycle is not just a calendar, it is a spiritual breathing of the earth. In the lecture cycles on the festivals and the cycle of the year, the seasons appear like gestures of the earth soul itself. Inhalation and exhalation, contraction and expansion, death and rebirth. Lent stands as a concentrated point of inward gathering before the great turning point of Easter. In Lent, the human being is invited to step back from the outer world, not out of rejection, but out of purification. This is not a cold withdrawal, but a warming inwardness. Steiner's language often suggests that the soul must learn to become still enough to perceive the spiritual behind the sensory. Lent is therefore not about becoming less human, but about becoming more human, more awake, more inwardly present, less driven by unconscious impulses. It is a time when the astral body, our bearer of desire, sympathy, and antipathy, unrest and longing, can be gently disciplined, not through harsh suppression, but through conscious ordering. From this perspective, fasting is not a goal in itself. It becomes a symbol and a support for an inner process. Steiner's spiritual science repeatedly emphasizes that the human being is not only physical, but etheric, astral, and ego being. When we reduce stimulation, consumption, and distraction, something begins to change in the interplay of these members. The etheric body, which carries the formative forces of life, becomes more perceptible inwardly when the soul does not constantly flood it with excitations. The astral body can become quieter, less scattered, and the ego can begin to find a firmer center. Lent becomes a time when the human being can sense again. I am not identical with my cravings, my reactions, my moods. I can relate to them. I can shape them. Steiner's approach always leads toward freedom. He does not preach Lent as an obligation imposed from outside, but as an opportunity for inner sovereignty. The question is not, what must I renounce? But rather, what in me has become too loud, too automatic, too powerful, and what would happen if I gently placed it into silence? Lent becomes a laboratory of inner observation. A person begins to notice how much of daily life is driven by habit rather than intention. The smallest renunciation of unnecessary speech, of constant checking, of restless entertainment, can become an opening through which the soul begins to hear itself again. And this inner hearing is not a narcissistic turning inward. In Steiner's tone, true inwardness leads to moral strengthening and to a deeper relationship with the world. Lent is not meant to make the human being closed. It is meant to make the human being more open, open in a purified way. When the soul becomes quieter, it can begin to perceive the suffering of others more clearly without immediately defending itself. Compassion becomes more real. Responsibility becomes less theoretical. Lent becomes a time of moral ripening. This moral ripening is connected with the deepest Christian mystery, the mystery of Golgotha. Steiner speaks of the Christ impulse as something that entered Earth evolution in order to transform not only human thinking, but the very conditions of life and death. In his lectures, the Passion is not merely a story of betrayal and pain, it is a spiritual turning point for the earth. Lent, then, is not only psychological preparation, it is an attunement to a cosmic event. The soul is invited to align itself with a reality that is greater than personal biography, the reality of sacrificial love as a force that changes the world. What makes Lent particularly significant in Steiner's view is that it stands in contrast to the typical modern relationship to suffering. Modern life often treats suffering as meaningless, an accident to be eliminated as quickly as possible. Steiner does not glorify suffering, but he does insist that spiritual reality can be encountered through the way the human being bears difficulty. Lent offers a protected seasonal space in which the human being can meet discomfort consciously, without dramatization. The smallest voluntary difficulty, an act of restraint, a deliberate simplification, creates an inner muscle. This muscle is not hardness, it is steadiness. It is the ability to remain present even when the soul would prefer to flee. In this way, Lent becomes a preparation for meeting life itself. Because life always contains thresholds. Life always demands transformation. Lent is a yearly image of this truth, that the new cannot be born without the old loosening its grip. The soul cannot awaken without passing through zones of darkness. Not because darkness is holy, but because the soul must learn to kindle its own light. Lent teaches the human being to stop demanding constant brightness from the world and instead to begin creating brightness inwardly through courage, truthfulness, and devotion. Steiner often describes the Christ event as the great answer to the deepest human loneliness, the loneliness of the ego that awakens to itself and realizes it is separated from the divine. Lent can be understood as the time when this loneliness is allowed to be felt, not as despair, but as the starting point of real spiritual longing. Many people try to escape longing by filling life with noise. Lent dignifies longing. It says, you may feel the emptiness, and in that emptiness, you may discover what the soul truly seeks. This is why Lent is not a gloomy season in its essence. It is a season of truth, and truth can feel severe, but it is ultimately liberating. When Steiner speaks of the Gospels, he often emphasizes that they are not merely historical documents, but initiation texts, texts that speak in images of inner realities. In that sense, Lent becomes a time to approach the Passion narrative not as a sentimental drama, but as a path of consciousness. The events of Holy Week can be experienced inwardly as stages: the purification of the soul, the confrontation with betrayal within the human being, the solitude of the inner Gethsemane, the encounter with the forces that would break the will, and finally, the possibility of surrendering the lower self so that a higher life may arise. In Steiner's language, the human being carries within themselves not only personal impulses, but also cosmic influences, forces that seek to bind the human being to materialism, fear, pride, and spiritual sleep. He names these influences with precision: luciferic temptation toward false light and premature spirituality, aromantic hardening into cold intellect and dead mechanism. Lent can be seen as a yearly counter-movement to both. It is not an escape into fantasy, Lucifer, nor a dry moralism, Ahriman, but a middle path of inner strengthening. It invites the soul to become warm and clear at the same time. This warmth and clarity are exactly what the modern world lacks. We often have warmth without clarity, emotion without truth, or clarity without warmth, analysis without compassion. Lent, approached spiritually, becomes a school for the balance of heart and mind. One begins to sense true spirituality is not emotional intoxication, and it is not cold abstraction. It is a living, moral perception of reality. Steiner also points toward the earth itself as participating in the Christ event. The earth is not a dead rock in space. It is a being in evolution. The seasonal rhythms are expressions of its life. Lent occurs when the earth begins to awaken from winter's inwardness, but has not yet reached spring's blossoming. This is why it carries a special mood, a mood of quiet expectancy. It is like the moment before dawn, when darkness is still present, but the first forces of light are already working. The soul that becomes sensitive in Lent can feel this before dawn quality inwardly. Something is approaching. Something wants to be born. This is why Lent is not merely a time to become better, but a time to become more receptive. In Steiner's tone, receptivity is an active deed. It requires inner preparation. Just as the soil must be loosened to receive the seed, the soul must be loosened from its hard crust of habit to receive the impulses of renewal. Lent is that loosening. And this renewal is not only personal, it is connected with humanity's future. Steiner speaks of epochs of consciousness and the task of developing a free spiritual life. Lent, in this wider view, becomes a yearly reminder that human evolution depends on inner transformation. The world cannot be healed only by outer reforms. Outer reforms are necessary, but they will always be insufficient if the human being remains inwardly unchanged. Lent points to the truth that the future of humanity is decided in the inner life, in whether the human being can become truthful, courageous, morally awake. This is why, in a Steiner-inspired Lent, one might practice not only renunciation, but also positive inner deeds. One might practice a daily moment of silence, not as relaxation, but as devotion. One might practice a brief evening review of the day to become more conscious of patterns. One might practice speaking less and listening more. One might practice a small act of kindness, done anonymously. These are not moral decorations. They are spiritual exercises that gradually transform the etheric and astral forces and strengthen the ego's capacity to guide life. In this context, Lent becomes deeply connected with biography. Each year, Lent arrives again, but we are not the same person as last year. The questions change, the tasks shift. Lent becomes like a mirror held up by the year itself. What in you must die away now? What in you wants to be born? The human being who lives with the festivals does not live in repetitive cycles. They live in spirals. The same point returns, but on a higher or deeper level. Steiner's festival indications often carry this sense that time is not empty. Time is filled with meaning. The great festivals are not invented, they are discovered. They correspond to spiritual realities that can be experienced if the soul becomes attentive. Lent, therefore, is not a human tradition imposed upon nature. It is a response to nature's own gesture, a conscious participation in the earth's path toward Easter. And Easter, in Steiner's view, is not merely spring symbolism. It is the proclamation that life is stronger than death, not as an idea, but as a reality rooted in the Christ impulse. Lent prepares the human being to approach Easter not superficially, as a seasonal celebration, but inwardly, as an event of resurrection within the soul. Resurrection, then, is not only what happens after death, it is what happens whenever the human being becomes capable of renewing themselves from within. The deepest Lent question is therefore not, how can I become purified? But, how can I become capable of receiving the Christ impulse more consciously? And this question is not answered through sentiment. It is answered through inner work, through truthfulness, through patience, through a willingness to bear what is difficult without hatred, and through the steady cultivation of inner light. In this sense, Lent becomes one of the most practical spiritual seasons. It teaches the human being how to deal with themselves. It teaches how to work with desire without being enslaved by it. It teaches how to simplify without becoming rigid. It teaches how to endure silence without fear. It teaches how to carry one's own cross, not as a tragic identity, but as a path toward freedom. When Lent is approached in this way, it becomes deeply healing, not because it magically removes problems, but because it changes the soul's relationship to problems. It strengthens the inner observer. It awakens the moral imagination. It creates space. And in that space, the human being may begin to sense what Steiner often points toward, that the spiritual world is not far away, but near. Yet it can only be perceived when the soul becomes quiet enough to receive it. Then Lent is no longer a burden. It becomes a threshold, a gate into deeper life, a season where the human being learns again that true strength is not loud, and true light is not forced. It is born, it grows, it rises like dawn, when the soul has prepared the night to become transparent. If we remain within the Steinerian mood of Lent, we begin to notice that this season does not work only through concepts, but through atmosphere. It carries a particular spiritual temperature, a specific inner climate, and this climate is not arbitrary. It arises because the human being is woven into the life of the earth more deeply than modern thinking usually admits. Lent is a time when the earth's own inwardness begins to change its quality. The winter contraction is still present, but it is no longer simply a shutting in. Something begins to press outward from within, as though the earth were preparing to speak again after a long silence. In spiritual science, the year is not a neutral succession of months. It is a living metamorphosis. The earth is not merely surrounded by space, it is embraced by cosmic forces. The stars, the sun path, and the movements of the heavens are not only physical motions, but expressions of spiritual activity. In the winter, the earth is, as it were, more open to the cosmos in its inner being, while outwardly it appears closed and lifeless. The human being who lives attentively through this time can sense that the deepest forces are at work precisely when the surface is quiet. Lent belongs to this hidden working. It is the season when the soul can become aware that spiritual development does not depend on outer excitement. The modern person often believes that growth comes through intensity, more experiences, more stimulation, more constant input. Lent teaches the opposite. It shows that growth can come through subtraction. When something is removed, noise, distraction, excess, another reality begins to appear. The soul begins to sense its own depth. Steiner's language often points toward the difference between an outer life that is filled and an inner life that is full. Many people have lives crowded with activities and yet inwardly empty. Lent invites a reversal. It creates an opening for an inner fullness that does not depend on quantity, but on quality. A single quiet moment can contain more reality than an entire day of scattered impressions. This is why Lent is not simply a moral season. It is a perceptual season. It trains the soul to perceive more deeply. In this training, the human being meets the threshold between ordinary consciousness and a more spiritual mode of knowing. Steiner repeatedly emphasizes that spiritual cognition does not begin with visions or extraordinary states. It begins with a refinement of attention. It begins when the soul learns to become still enough to notice what is normally overlooked. Lent is especially suited for this because it naturally reduces outer distraction. Nature itself offers fewer impressions. The world is simpler, and therefore the soul has fewer excuses not to turn inward. But this turning inward is not automatic. It requires decision. And here the moral element returns. Lent is a time when the human being can choose to live more deliberately. One can choose to speak more truthfully, to think more carefully, to act with more responsibility. Such choices are not merely ethical. They change the inner substance of the soul. They strengthen the I organization, the center that can bring order into the astral turbulence and warmth into the etheric life forces. In Steiner's view, the modern human being is in danger of losing the living connection between thinking and reality. Thinking becomes abstract, mechanical, and detached. Lent is a time when thinking can be warmed again, not by emotionality, but by sincerity. Sincere thinking is thinking that does not seek to dominate reality, but to serve it. It is thinking that becomes humble enough to listen. This humility is a spiritual force. It prepares the soul for true insight. At this point, Lent becomes connected with the question of truth. Steiner's entire spiritual science stands under the demand for truthfulness not as intellectual correctness alone, but as a moral quality. Truthfulness means that the soul refuses to live in self-deception. It refuses to hide behind excuses. It dares to look at itself as it is. Lent is a season in which this truthfulness can be practiced gently but firmly. Many people fear such self-encounter because they associate it with guilt or harsh judgment. But in Steiner's tone, true self-knowledge is not meant to crush the soul. It is meant to liberate it. The soul becomes free only when it can see itself clearly. Lent, therefore, is not a time of self-condemnation. It is a time of self-clarification. It is the season in which the human being can begin to separate the essential from the non-essential within themselves. This separation is also connected with the deeper meaning of the Passion. The Passion narrative, approached spiritually, shows that the highest can only enter the human being when the lower is surrendered. The surrender is not destruction. It is transformation. The old form must loosen so that a new form can arise. Lent is the time when the soul rehearses this surrender in small human ways, letting go of compulsions, letting go of unnecessary desires, letting go of the need to always be right, always be seen, always be confirmed. Steiner's descriptions often suggest that the human being carries within themselves forces that resist such surrender. There is a part of the soul that wants comfort, safety, and self-justification. Lent exposes this part. It brings it into view, not to shame it, but to transform it. Transformation begins when something is seen, and seeing requires light. Lent is therefore a paradoxical season. It appears darker, yet it is precisely a season of inner illumination. The modern world, as Steiner describes it, is increasingly dominated by forces that harden human consciousness. There is a tendency toward purely material explanations, toward cold intellectuality, toward a view of the human being as a machine. Lent, in its true spiritual character, becomes a counterforce. It reminds the soul that human life is not exhausted by mechanism. It reminds the soul that the deepest realities are moral and spiritual. This does not mean rejecting science or reason. Steiner's approach is not anti-intellectual. It seeks to spiritualize the intellect, to lift thinking into a higher responsibility. Lent becomes a time to practice this. One can observe how often thinking becomes judgmental, cynical, or merely reactive. And one can practice thinking that is more patient, more exact, more reverent. This is not sentimental reverence. It is reverence for reality itself. In this way, Lent prepares not only for Easter, but for a new relationship to life. A person who lives Lent consciously begins to carry a different inner posture. They become less dependent on outer circumstances. They become less easily thrown off balance. They develop a quiet strength. This strength is not dramatic. It is the strength of inner steadiness. Steiner often points to the importance of endurance in spiritual life. Endurance is the capacity to continue without immediate reward. Lent is a season that trains endurance. It teaches the soul to remain faithful to inner effort even when the outer world offers no applause. In this fidelity, something changes. The soul becomes more real to itself. It becomes less a bundle of moods and more a being with direction. This direction is not imposed by dogma. It arises from within. It arises when the I begins to awaken. Lent is therefore a season of awakening, not the bright awakening of spring blossoms, but the deep awakening of conscience, of truthfulness, of inner responsibility. It is the awakening of the human being to the fact that life is not merely something that happens, but something that must be shaped. And here, Lent reveals its most practical spiritual meaning. It is the time when the human being can begin to shape themselves, not through force, but through attention, not through perfectionism, but through sincerity, not through fear, but through devotion to what is true. In the next movement of this theme, Lent must be seen in direct relation to the great inner stages of Holy Week and the mystery of Golgotha itself, because in Steiner's view, Lent is not only preparation for a festival, but preparation for a spiritual reality that continues to work within humanity and within every individual soul. When Lent is carried toward its culmination, it gradually becomes inseparable from the inner path of Holy Week. In Rudolf Steiner's Spiritual Science, the days that lead from the entry into Jerusalem through the Last Supper, Gethsemane, the crucifixion, and the resurrection are not only historical remembrances, they are archetypal stages of consciousness. They describe a drama that is woven into the human soul itself. And Lent is the season in which the soul can prepare to approach this drama not as distant narrative, but as living reality. Steiner's tone here is never merely devotional. He speaks of the mystery of Golgotha as a turning point of earth evolution, an event through which the conditions of human existence were transformed. Yet precisely because it is a cosmic event, it also touches the most intimate regions of the human being. Lent is the time when the soul becomes capable of sensing that its own inner struggles are not merely personal psychology, but reflections, often faint but real, of greater spiritual processes. As Lent deepens, the soul begins to notice a certain intensification. What was at first a gentle withdrawal from outer distractions becomes a confrontation with inner content. Silence is never empty for long. When the soul grows quieter, it begins to hear what it has avoided. Old grief, resentment, fear, vanity, and restlessness may rise. Many people interpret this as failure. I tried to become calmer, and instead I became more troubled. But in a Steinerian understanding, this is often the first sign of success. The soul is beginning to perceive itself more truthfully. This is why Lent cannot be reduced to moral self-improvement. It is a process of purification, and purification means that what was hidden becomes visible. The human being begins to see the forces that normally drive them unconsciously. Steiner speaks of the astral body as the bearer of these impulses, desires, sympathies, antipathies, and inner storms. In ordinary life, these storms are masked by activity. In Lent, they can appear more clearly. But the goal is not to suppress them. The goal is to bring them into relationship with the I. The I is the power that can transform the astral body, not by violence, but by conscious shaping. Lent becomes a season in which the I can practice this shaping. One learns to pause before reacting, to observe before judging, to breathe inwardly before speaking. These small gestures are not insignificant. They are the beginning of a new mastery, an inner mastery that does not dominate others, but governs oneself. Steiner often describes the human being as standing between opposing spiritual tendencies. On the one side, forces that pull consciousness upward into premature light, into pride, fantasy, and spiritual arrogance. On the other side, forces that pull consciousness downward into coldness, cynicism, and materialistic deadness. Lent is a time when these forces can be felt more distinctly. The soul becomes more sensitive to what is false light and what is true light, to what is dead thinking and what is living thinking. Holy Week, approached spiritually, intensifies this discernment. The entry into Jerusalem can be experienced inwardly as the moment when the soul senses a higher impulse approaching. There is enthusiasm, expectation, a sense that something great is near. But this enthusiasm is quickly tested. The crowd that welcomes can also turn away. The human being learns that outer support is unreliable. The soul must find a deeper foundation. The Last Supper carries the mystery of communion, the possibility that the highest spiritual reality can unite with the human being inwardly. In Steiner's view, this is not only ritual, it is the image of a real spiritual nourishment. The soul can be sustained by forces that do not come from the physical world. Lent prepares the human being to recognize this nourishment, not as emotion, but as strength. Then comes Gethsemane. Steiner often points to this as one of the most profound moments in the entire Christian mystery. It is a moment of solitude, of trembling, of the experience that even the closest companions cannot follow. Inwardly, Gethsemane corresponds to the moment when the human being realizes that no one can carry their destiny for them. No ideology, no community, no teacher can replace the inner decision of the I. Lent prepares the soul for this solitude, not to make it bitter, but to make it strong. The crucifixion in Steiner's spiritual science is not merely physical suffering, it is the meeting of the highest love with the full weight of earthly existence. It is the point where spirit enters the deepest density. Inwardly, this corresponds to the moment when the human being must let go of the lower self-image, the self that is built on pride, fear, and attachment. Something must die in the soul for something higher to be born. Lent is the long approach to this inner dying, not dramatic, but real. And then comes the silence of Holy Saturday. This silence is often overlooked, but it is essential. It is the time when nothing seems to happen outwardly. Yet in spiritual reality, something immense is taking place. Steiner's tone suggests that the deepest transformations occur in such silence, beyond the reach of ordinary consciousness. In the soul, this corresponds to moments when we have let go of something old, but the new has not yet appeared. These are the most vulnerable moments of development. Many people flee them. Lent trains the soul to endure them. Only then can Easter become real. In Steiner's view, Easter is not merely a symbol of spring. It is the proclamation that spirit is stronger than death, that the human being is not confined to the physical. It is also the awakening of a new relationship between the human I and the spiritual world. Lent prepares this awakening by strengthening the I, purifying the astral body, and creating inner space. What is decisive here is that Lent is not meant to end in heaviness. Its seriousness is a gateway to joy, but a joy that is deeper than comfort. It is a joy born of truth, of freedom, of inner victory. The soul that has passed through Lent consciously does not celebrate Easter as entertainment. It experiences Easter as renewal. In the final movement of this theme, we must look at how Lent can be lived practically in modern life without becoming rigid or moralistic, how Steiner's approach leads to a path that is inwardly free, ethically strong, and spiritually realistic, and how Lent can become a yearly school for courage, clarity, and quiet inner resurrection. To speak of Lent in a truly Steinerian way, one must finally return from the great spiritual images to the everyday reality of modern life. For Steiner never intended spiritual science to remain a beautiful worldview floating above practical existence. He constantly sought to bring spiritual insight into the concrete shaping of life. Lent, therefore, must not become a rigid tradition or a mood of piety that has little to do with real human struggles. It must become a living practice, free, conscious, and inwardly truthful. The first thing Steiner would warn against is moralism. Moralism is the attempt to force the soul into improvement through pressure, guilt, or external rules. This does not strengthen the I. It weakens it. It creates inner tension, pride, or discouragement. Lent, if approached in this way, becomes sterile. The true Lent mood is not I must become better, but rather, I wish to become more awake. Awakening is not achieved through self-punishment, but through clarity and devotion. In modern life, one of the greatest obstacles to this awakening is distraction. The soul is constantly pulled outward. Messages, noise, information, urgency, entertainment. Even spiritual life can become another form of consumption. Steiner's Lent impulse would therefore begin very simply, with a conscious reduction of what scatters the soul. This may be small, less unnecessary speech, fewer impulses to check and react, fewer habits that fill every silence. Such reductions are not meant to make life bleak. They are meant to create space. Space is a spiritual reality. When the soul has space, it can breathe. When it can breathe, it can perceive. And perception is the beginning of transformation. Lent is not primarily about what is removed. It is about what becomes possible through removal. The soul begins to notice its own movements. It begins to see how often it lives in automatic reactions. It begins to recognize the difference between what is essential and what is merely habitual. In Steiner's language, this recognition is connected with the strengthening of the I. The I becomes strong not through intensity, but through continuity. A small inner exercise done daily is more transformative than a dramatic effort done once. Lent, therefore, invites rhythm. Rhythm is one of the deepest healing forces in spiritual science. Rhythm creates stability without rigidity. It allows the etheric body to work harmoniously and gives the astral body a form it can inhabit without chaos. A simple daily rhythm during Lent might include a quiet morning moment, just 1 or 2 minutes of inward recollection before the day begins. Not to feel spiritual, but to remember the direction of one's life. It might include an evening review of the day, not to judge oneself harshly, but to see more clearly. Steiner often indicates that such a review can become a powerful tool. One learns to look at life from above, to observe patterns, to become less identified with moods. This strengthens freedom. Lent can also become a school of thinking. Steiner repeatedly emphasizes that thinking can be transformed from a dead mirror of the outer world into a living organ of perception. In modern life, thinking is often driven by opinion, comparison, and mental noise. Lent invites a different kind of thinking, quieter, more exact, more devoted to truth. One can practice speaking less internally and listening more. One can practice not immediately forming judgments. One can practice letting a question live without forcing an answer. This is not weakness. It is spiritual discipline. This discipline becomes especially important in relation to negativity. Modern consciousness is easily pulled into criticism, cynicism, and suspicion. These are not harmless mental habits. They are forces that harden the soul. Lent is a time to notice this hardening and gently soften it, not by pretending everything is good, but by refusing to let the soul become poisoned. Steiner's approach does not deny evil. It seeks to meet evil with clarity and courage rather than bitterness. Lent can therefore become a season of inner hygiene. The heart of Lent, however, is not intellectual refinement, but moral deepening. Steiner's spirituality is fundamentally ethical. The spiritual world is approached not through curiosity, but through moral strength. Lent is a time when moral strength can be practiced in small, real deeds. A restrained word when one wants to wound, a patient listening when one wants to interrupt, an act of kindness done without being seen, a decision to stop feeding resentment. These are not sentimental acts, they are spiritual acts. They transform the astral body and bring warmth into the etheric forces. This warmth is crucial. Lent is often associated with coldness and denial, but in Steiner's view, true spiritual seriousness is warm. It is filled with compassion and reverence. If Lent makes a person rigid, proud, or harsh, it has missed its essence. True Lent makes the soul more human, not less. It makes one more capable of love, not more withdrawn. It makes one more truthful, not more judgmental. In this way, Lent prepares Easter in a very real sense. Easter is not merely a festival one attends, it is a state of consciousness that must be prepared. The soul that has created inner space, strengthened rhythm, refined thinking, and deepened moral life becomes capable of receiving Easter forces. And these forces are not merely poetic. They are experienced as renewal, a new courage, a new lightness, a new capacity to begin again. Steiner's view of Easter is inseparable from the idea of resurrection as an inner possibility. The human being can be resurrected from within their own heaviness. They can rise from mechanical living into conscious living. They can rise from resentment into forgiveness, from fear into courage, from distraction into presence. Lent is the path that makes such rising possible. It is the school of inner resurrection. Therefore, the true Steinerian Lent is not a season of gloom. It is a season of preparation. It is the quiet work of the soul before the dawn. It is the time when the human being learns again that the greatest transformations are not loud. They occur in silence, in perseverance, in inner truthfulness. And perhaps this is why Lent is so necessary today. Our time is filled with noise, speed, and fragmentation. Lent offers the counter-gesture, inwardness, slowness, and wholeness. It reminds the human being that spiritual life is not a weekend experience, but a daily shaping of the soul. It asks for courage, not the courage of dramatic acts, but the courage to become inwardly real. When Lent is lived in this way, it becomes a yearly renewal of freedom. It teaches the human being to stand within themselves, to govern themselves, and to open themselves to the Christ impulse as a living force of transformation. Then Easter is not merely celebrated, it is encountered. And what is encountered is not only a memory of the past, but a power for the future, a power that can make the human being more awake, more responsible, and more truly human.